Good morning, everyone. Welcome to NCVO's launch of our latest Time Well Spent report. It's great to see so many of you here this morning. Thank you so much to the hundreds of you that have joined today's event. I'm Alex. I'm Director of Influencing and Engagement at NCVO and responsible for influencing work, including kind of our research work. And so I'm enormously proud to be chairing today's event as we explore the latest findings, looking particularly at the experience of volunteers. We've got a packed kind of hour and a quarter this morning, but just before we start, I just want to say we kind of last published our full Time Well Spent report in January 2019. And Theresa May was still Prime Minister at this point. The main focus that we were talking about at that time was around meaningful votes on Brexit deals. It was before COVID hit, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and before the kind of cost of living and energy crisis kind of hit communities and affected charities and, of course, volunteering. It was also before we saw enormous mobilizations of volunteers through the pandemic, the transformation of many opportunities, particularly from in real life to virtual volunteering, and of course, sadly, the stopping of many volunteer opportunities under a number of national lockdowns. So much has happened in just 4.5 years. And so the context today, as we launch our latest Time Well Spent report, does feel kind of enormously different. And today we'll have a chance to hear kind of what impact or not those things have had on volunteering across the country. Finally, just as a kind of chair's privilege, as I get at the very beginning, just to say we're enormously grateful to DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, for their support for this year's publication. Of course, we're thankful for the financial contribution that has enabled us to produce this, as well as some forthcoming pieces of research as well, but also for their insight at the analysis stage, at the report writing stage, and the support that the Minister has given, who has written the foreword for today's publication and continue to be a champion for volunteering. So thank you to DCMS. Today, we will do a few things. So by the end of today, you will have heard from kind of the lead researchers who've been working on Time Well Spent over the kind of past year. And we'll kind of hear more about the findings and what they mean, what they tell us about volunteering at the moment and what it might mean for policy and practice in the future. We're going to hear from some fantastic panelists, and I'm going to kind of introduce those in a second, but we're going to hear from quite different perspectives on today's findings. So some reflections from a kind of stellar panel from their experience leading policy or leading kind of working volunteer involving organisations to share some of their thoughts on today's findings. And of course, over to you with the opportunity to share your questions and reflections as part of a kind of Q&A later, but also through the chat box that I can see is kind of furiously kind of coming in with comments. So please do use that as the space for sharing your thoughts today as well. So what does all that look like in terms of time? Well, we're almost at the end of the welcome, and then I'm going to hand over very shortly to our lead researchers, Amy and Ray from NCVO's research team, who are going to talk us through today's findings. We've then got three fantastic panelists joining us. Alison Jeffrey from DCMS to give us that kind of policy perspective on today's findings. Susie Holland, Deputy Chief Exec at Eczema Outreach Support, so bringing kind of a national charity perspective. And Stephanie Thompson from Community Impact Bucks, who's going to be talking about the kind of infrastructure and how kind of infrastructure community is supporting volunteering as well. So a few kind of, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end, and then there'll be some reflections and some signposting as we finish. And we'll finish certainly no later than 11:30. For that Q&A, just kind of to explain how that will work. The Q&A is kind of questions through the Q&A functionality on Zoom. So along the bottom of your menu bar, you probably see there's kind of mute, stop video, or chat, Q&A. If you click Q&A, that is the place where you can type your questions, and we will kind of select questions to answer at the Q&A section. The chat box, as you'll see, is kind of very busy. So please, if you do have a question, please try to avoid putting it in the chat box, just because it might get lost in amongst the many kind of messages that are on there. Please do put them on the Q&A function, but do use the chat box to share your comments, thoughts, reflections on anything you're hearing today and any of the findings. So lastly, from me, is just some housekeeping. You'll notice, hopefully, that we have closed captions or subtitles are enabled. You can turn these on and off by clicking the CC icon in the toolbar, probably at the bottom of your screen. We'll be sharing the PowerPoint slide deck for today in the chat box. Hopefully, it should already be there. And so if you need to kind of zoom in or zoom out of the slides, do download a copy of those and kind of follow along at the slides, either at your own pace or as we're talking them through on your own computer rather than through the shared screen. A couple of other final things. Hopefully everyone's fueled with coffee or tea. We don't have a break until we finish at 11:30. I've mentioned about things like the chat. All of we are in kind of webinar presenter mode only. So it's only microphones and video from the panelists that will be on. So no one else can. And although we are recording today's session, as it said at the very top of today's session, it's again only panelists that are visible and that can be recorded. But please do note that if you're attending today's webinar, it is being recorded. That is all from me in terms of the housekeeping and the welcome and introduction. It now only leaves me to hand it over to Amy McGarvey and Ray Kaimura, who are going to talk through the findings and present this year's Time Well Spent. Amy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's really great to be here to present the latest Time Well Spent findings. I was just having a bit of a surreal kind of deja vu moment now, thinking back to presenting the 2019 findings in room 1 at NCVO. Perhaps some of you were there with us at that time, and just thinking how much has happened since then. And I guess that is really the backdrop to this new research. I'm just going to start with a little bit of background, especially for those who might not be as familiar with Time Well Spent. As Alex said, this is our kind of NCVO research program focusing on people's experience of volunteering. We mentioned our original research in 2019. This was based on a large national survey, and we did a number of follow-up reports on different themes following that. This new research is based on the latest data from a national survey, this time of over 7,000 adults across Great Britain, and it was carried out at the end of last year. As Alex mentioned, it's funded by the DCMS, and it's really great to have Alison here today as part of our panel. So we've said how much of an eventful few years that it's been, and what our research really aims to look at is what does volunteering, and in particular the volunteer experience, look like now? And we're reflecting on some of the things that have and haven't changed since our original survey. So what have we learned? I'm just going to start by talking a bit about the context. And before we come on to our Time Well Spent findings, it's worth just starting with that kind of bigger picture about what we're seeing around volunteer participation overall. The government's Community Life Service survey, which is our best source on this, we've seen a general trend of decline in volunteering through groups, clubs or organisations, what we know as formal volunteering in recent years. We see the most notable drop between the years around 2019-20 to 2021-22, where we saw the proportion of the UK volunteering formally at least once a month, so that's the purple line, dropping from 23% to 16%. And when we turn to our own Time Well Spent research, we see this decrease reflected when we look at some of the particular activities that are taking place. So to give an example, raising money or taking part in sponsored events, this has gone down from 11 to 6% since the original survey. This new survey covers the period of the end of 2021 to end of 2022. So it spans that kind of transition of final restrictions from COVID through to them fully lifting. So it's likely that we're seeing some of the impacts of this on these kinds of activities in particular. And we'll probably need to wait a little bit to see in the coming years whether that trend of decline in formal volunteering that I showed will continue or whether things will bounce back. Now looking on to some other aspects of the volunteering context, our time well spent findings highlight the way in which local community very much remains at the heart of much of our volunteering. Over 3/4 carry out their volunteering in their neighbourhoods. Over half volunteer for an organisation which operates at a local level. And as you can see here, local community and neighbourhood groups are the most common area or cause that the organisation is involved in amongst our survey respondents. And we know how during the pandemic in particular, there was so much local-based community activity taking place, especially with the rise of thousands of mutual aid groups across the country. It's also reflected in the kind of places and spaces where volunteering activities are taking place, with a community space as the most common location. But it's interesting to note how remote volunteering, so volunteering online or over the phone, has become increasingly common, with just under a third, 31%, saying that they do some of their volunteering this way. And the equivalent of 18% of recent volunteers exclusively volunteer this way. Interestingly, as we found in 2019, this was more common amongst disabled volunteers, which indicates that it might be a continued way in which disabled people are accessing volunteering opportunities. So local community is very much at the heart of our volunteering, or much of it, but the ways people give time, as we've seen, have diversified a bit more. So we've spoken about some of the ways people engage with volunteering and the changes, but some things haven't changed. And one of those is the volunteers' core motivations. Whether it's the motivations to start or whether it's to continue, that feeling of wanting to make a difference is really strongly there still. It's that driving force. It still has to work practically for people though, and we'll come to discuss this later when Ray talks about the barriers and enablers to volunteering. So I'm now going to move on to talk a bit about the volunteer experience and impact, and this is really the kind of key focus of our time well spent research. I'll start with the headline findings, which is really positive. And that's when we look at overall satisfaction, it's really high. So 92% say that they're very or fairly satisfied with their volunteering. And this positivity is also reflected when we look at more specific aspects of volunteer management and people's perceptions of the volunteer involving organisation. So just a few examples are there in the slide around there being a culture of respect and trust in the organisation, the group or club being flexible around the time they give, and feeling supported. Again, all of those, the majority of volunteers are very positive about. And this is a real testament to those who have worked really hard with volunteers, especially through some challenging times in the past years. Volunteers also report a wide range of positive impacts on their lives. You can see the wide range here from enjoyment, which comes out top, through to improved mental health and well-being, cited by 3/4 of the volunteers, and a similar proportion say it's given them new skills and experiences. And that's just a handful of examples from that long list that you can see here. Encouragingly, we saw that remote volunteering, which as I mentioned is now increasingly common, is a positive experience. So those who volunteer exclusively by phone or online, 92% say that they're very or fairly satisfied, and that's the same proportion as those who don't volunteer in this way. And the majority, 82%, say that they feel supported, and again, 88% say that they agree that they feel a sense of belonging. So that indicates that it's not impacted on these aspects of their volunteering. So we've talked about the kind of positive news, but we need to acknowledge some of the challenges that the findings raise. What we found is that while overall satisfaction, while still high, it has dipped slightly since 2019 from 96% to 92%. And some of the groups that we highlighted in 2019 that were reporting a lower level of satisfaction continue to do so. So that includes young volunteers compared with older, public sector volunteers compared with those volunteering for civil society organisations, disabled volunteers compared with non-disabled, and volunteers from ethnic minority communities compared with white volunteers. And I should note on the last of these groups that we're going to be doing a dedicated piece of research, again supported by DCMS, to look at the experience of these volunteers because we have a boost sample which we can look into that data in a really deep dive way. So we're really looking forward to sharing on that. So we've talked a bit about the lower satisfaction rates and there's some of those groups as well. And it's hard to say exactly what's causing that satisfaction to be lower. But I want to talk a little bit about 3 areas which raise specific challenges and reflections, which might give a bit of insight into what might be going on. So the first is around equity, diversity and inclusion. We've all seen efforts in the sector, especially fueled by global movements, to welcome volunteers from a wide range of backgrounds and address barriers. Yet our findings show that among recent volunteers, generally, that a lower proportion of these volunteers say that they see volunteers alongside them coming from a wide range of backgrounds compared with before. Coupled with the lower satisfaction amongst diverse groups that I just mentioned, this indicates that there's much more work to do in this area. The second area that I want to touch upon is expenses. We found in this survey that just over half, 55%, agree that their volunteer-involving organisation would reimburse their expenses if they wanted them to. And interestingly, 16% say that they don't know whether they would or not. And these proportions are pretty much exactly the same as in 2019. And we know that the cost of living crisis has hit people hard, and Ray will talk about this later in relation to barriers and enablers. But whilst this context has changed, it's clear that practice hasn't yet. And that proportion of don't know indicates that we need to do some more work in clarifying expense practices. Finally, our findings indicate that some of the kind of pressures that volunteers may be feeling. A quarter, or just over a quarter, agree that their volunteering is becoming too much like paid work. And around a similar proportion agree that the group, club or organisation has unreasonable expectations in terms of how much they do. And these have both gone up since 2019 from 19% and 17% respectively. We separately asked a question to all survey respondents, volunteers and non-volunteers, about what was important to them around volunteering. And while making a difference came out top, which supports our findings around that kind of motivation being key, not feeling pressured came second. And we know from our own research and others that many have felt some feelings of fatigue and burnout from the challenges of the last years, and this may be a reflection of that. Recent data from Pro Bono Economics and Nottingham Trent University found that more charities believe their volunteers' well-being has declined than increased, which indicates that this might be continuing. This data just came out very recently. So we need to acknowledge this and continue to look out for volunteers' well-being. So we've seen that when it comes to volunteer experience, there's much to celebrate with high levels of satisfaction overall, but definitely some challenges raised. So I'm now going to hand over to Ray to talk about the volunteer retention and a little bit about barriers and enablers to volunteering. And I'll come back at the end to share some final reflections. Over to you, Ray.
Thank you, Amy. We'll now look at what our data says about volunteer retention. So reflecting on what we saw with volunteer satisfaction, volunteers' likelihood to continue volunteering dropped slightly since 2019, since we last surveyed. When we asked if volunteers wanted to continue in the next 12 months, and back in 2019, 80% of them said that they were either very or fairly likely. This went down to 77% in the most recent results. We can see some marked differences by age, so that's the column chart in blue right here, with volunteers being increasingly less likely to continue the younger they are, with 59% of 18 to 24-year-olds, in contrast to 86% of volunteers over 55. So it's a similar picture to what we saw in volunteer satisfaction. And when we think about younger volunteers as our future, this is a bit worrying. When we asked those who say they're unlikely to continue, the most common reason they gave was that they had less time because of changing circumstances. So 37% of those who say they're unlikely to continue picked this reason. But it should also be noted that while not the most common reason, it causes me too much stress here has risen since 2019. And this perhaps reflects some of the feelings around unreasonable expectations Amy just talked about. Also not necessarily the most main reasons, while most of the main reasons are not practical reasons for not continuing to volunteer, and experiences very much matter. The majority of those who are satisfied with their volunteering say they're likely to continue volunteering. Conversely, only a quarter of dissatisfied volunteers say they'll carry on. And this totally makes sense because people volunteer out of their own free will. So while we can't change people's circumstances that make them have to stop volunteering, we can still make volunteer experience a positive one. So what the data is showing is that even if volunteers may have to stop due to changing circumstances, a positive volunteer experience will make it easy for them to return in the future if they want to. And so similarly, volunteer retention is a mixed picture, quite similar pattern to what we saw in volunteer satisfaction. Volunteers are likely to continue volunteering, but there are some worrying signs. And we know that a quality volunteer experience is the key to retention. And now we're moving on to what prevents people from volunteering, and in turn, what encourages them to volunteer. And we asked people who haven't volunteered in the last 3 years or have never volunteered why they don't volunteer. As with reasons for stopping volunteering, main barriers are time-related, not wanting to make an ongoing commitment and doing other things with their spare time being the top 2 reasons for not volunteering. Slightly less common are work and study commitments. And interestingly, about 1 in 5 are non-volunteers and say that they haven't been asked or haven't thought about it, and therefore they don't volunteer. Most importantly, concerns around the financial impact of volunteering are an increasing barrier. 14% of non-volunteers say that they're worried about out-of-pocket expenses, and this increased from 5%. Also important to note here that this was higher amongst younger non-volunteers aged 18 to 24 at 18%. Needless to say that this was likely affected by the cost of living crisis. And as we saw earlier, volunteers are concerned about out-of-pocket expenses, so it's not surprising at all that non-volunteers are concerned about it too. As Amy said earlier, practice itself around reimbursing expenses hasn't changed, and this highlights the importance of reducing financial barriers to volunteering. When we ask around what would encourage non-volunteers to give time, the top things both relate to flexibility. So about 30% of non-volunteers say that flexibility with time, and 26% of them say flexibility with the way they give time would encourage them to start volunteering. We saw earlier again that the majority of volunteers say their volunteering was flexible. So Amy talked about 82% of volunteers say that their volunteering involving the organization was flexible around the time they give. So this seems to indicate that there's a gap, and this is more an issue in perception rather than reality. So we need to communicate this clearly to non-volunteers and volunteers alike. Remote volunteering doesn't negatively affect the experience, so we should also communicate that there are flexible opportunities, not just remote volunteering. And finally, we shouldn't forget that active, consistent recruitment efforts are important. 15% of non-volunteers say that if someone asked them to get involved, they would be encouraged to volunteer. 12% say that knowing about volunteering opportunities would also help. Volunteering involving organizations are already doing this, and our data shows that telling people to get involved is still very important. These could therefore be a proactive step organizations could do to get volunteers on board and take that first step into or back into volunteering. I'm now passing back to Amy to share final reflections.
Thanks so much, Ray. So we've just shared a lot of data in one go, so hopefully everyone's been able to absorb that a little bit, but I'm just going to share a few kind of summary and final reflections before we go over to the panel. I think we've seen that there's much to celebrate. Ray, if you wouldn't mind just passing over to the next slide, thank you. Overall, volunteer satisfaction is really high, and most feel really positively about how their volunteering is managed and organised. They also report a wide range of benefits, and all of this we shouldn't underestimate in the context of some challenging times that we've had. But there's still lots to work on, and we saw how satisfaction and likelihood to continue volunteering are down slightly. And there's that wider context with signs of declining participation through formal volunteering, which we saw at the start. We also need to continue efforts in equity, diversity and inclusion, as our findings suggest that these efforts haven't quite yet been realised fully. And we need to ensure that volunteer practice keeps up with the changing times with things like expenses. As Ray just talked about there at the end, there are some potential quick wins, perhaps, through asking people to get involved and through signposting to opportunities. And this might help encourage participation. But it's not enough just to get people through the door. We need to continue to provide that quality volunteer experience too, and that's something that we can influence. And while we expect people to stop and start volunteering throughout their lives, continuing this focus will help people keep people engaged throughout that lifetime. So overall, the findings show that now's that time to renew those efforts, taking on board our learnings and seizing opportunities. And this will help ensure that volunteering is still time well spent. And I'm very conscious that we, when we were planning this launch event, called it "Is Volunteering Still Time Well Spent?" And I think that, you know, with the positive headlines overall, we can safely say that it is. But the challenges show that there's still lots to do to ensure that it continues to be. And the vision for volunteering is a great opportunity for that, supporting the sector to navigate the inevitable changes ahead and to help us to move in a positive direction. So we've gone through as much as we can fit in a short presentation, but there's lots more in the report, which we'll share the link for. And I'm really excited now to hand back to Alex to introduce our panel and hear what they have to say about what the findings mean in practice and policy.
Thank you so much, Amy and Ray. And you can see just a huge number of kind of claps and thumbs up and hearts from kind of across the virtual room. I think a tremendous amount of work done to tell us this story. So thank you to both of you in particular. We've been just some housekeeping before I hand over to the panelists. Thank you to the kind of 20 people who have kind of submitted questions so far. If you still have more questions or you're still digesting some of the things that you've just heard from Amy and Ray, please do put them in the Q&A function, and please do continue sharing your comments in the chat box as well. We are using, if you're on Twitter, we are using the hashtag TimeWellSpent2023. So please do kind of comment on today's webinar there and also share the findings and your thoughts as well. We're now going to move to hear from three panelists from representing different, I suppose, stakeholders and constituencies as part of the kind of volunteering ecosystem. So as I mentioned earlier, we're joined by Alison Jeffrey, Deputy Director of Volunteering and Tackling Loneliness at DCMS, very much here to give a kind of policy perspective from kind of national government. We then have Susie Holland, Deputy Chief Exec at Eczema Outreach Support, a national charity based in Scotland, to tell us about kind of experience of working with volunteers and what the findings mean. And then Stephanie Thompson, VCSE and Community Development Manager at Community Impact Bucks, particularly thinking about the role of local infrastructure and very much what is being seen and experienced and how do we support organisations at local level as well. But first of all, we're going to hear from Alison Jeffrey from DCMS. Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much for that introduction. And good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is well. Yeah, thanks to NCVO for giving us an opportunity at DCMS to talk about what this research means to us and a little bit about how we're going to incorporate it into our policy thinking moving forward. So I'm aiming to cover, I guess, in the 5 or so minutes I've got, 3 key things. So I want to tell you a little bit about what DCMS's priorities are and how the Time Well Spent research could support those. a couple of reflections on the changing world of volunteering, and we've heard quite a bit of that already from Amy and Ray in terms of what the survey is telling us, and also perhaps just a couple of thoughts on kind of future opportunities for joint working and developments and things that could be coming up on the horizon. So firstly, I just wanted to say how amazing the Time Well Spent survey is as a piece of work. We think it's an incredibly valuable piece of research and resource for understanding the volunteer experience. So when the opportunity came up for DCMS to get involved, we were very keen to do so, and we're delighted to have provided the funding for this piece of work. We're going to use it to inform DCMS and indeed cross-government colleagues' policy development and delivery from 2023 and onwards. And we'll be looking at kind of what it tells us, what some viable interventions are for government now, and also looking ahead to a future spending review period. We don't know when that will be at the moment, but obviously there will be one coming up. In DCMS, generally we aim to encourage, obviously, and enable a lifetime of volunteering and other forms of social action and support better communities. So for us, understanding what widens participation in volunteering, or actually what prevents it, is really crucial for ensuring our programmes are impactful and targeted. And the role that Time Well Spent plays in identifying barriers and enablers to volunteering is particularly important here. And whilst some of the barriers may be long-standing, we do need to think creatively and in partnership about how we can break through some of them. So looking at the research, just to pick out a couple of stats, for instance, 33% of respondents said that they don't want to make an ongoing commitment, highlights the role for enabling more micro-volunteering, for example, similar to the NHS Volunteering Responders Programme. And put alongside the 14% of people who felt they didn't have the right skills or experience, and the high satisfaction rates we've heard about for people who digitally volunteer, it does feel like there's a space to investigate digital volunteering infrastructure and its future role in volunteering. And on micro-volunteering, which could appeal to people of all skills level if they know and understand the tasks that they might receive, it's an area we in DCMS are interested in, and we're currently working up some research plans to look into that issue. And it's something we'd be interested to hear more about from people on this webinar who are working alongside and with volunteers, and especially how volunteer managers plan to adapt to the changing world in their recruitment practices. So I'd be really interested to hear from attendees on that. And we can also see the range of positive impacts that volunteering has on the lives of those involved, from simply enjoying it to tangible improvements in mental health and well-being. And in government, we see volunteering as a great way to work towards one of our other key priorities, which is tackling loneliness, which is part of the work that my team does. And our Know Your Neighbourhood fund, which was launched earlier this year in March, drew on evidence like Time Well Spent during its development. And that fund is designed to widen participation in volunteering as a means of building greater social connections in more deprived areas, enabling more people to feel those positive benefits. And a central pillar of this is to build the evidence base about the impacts of volunteering interventions, and I think it'll be important to use the findings from this alongside Time Well Spent to help us build on that programme. And some of you may be involved in the delivery of the Know Your Neighbourhood Fund, which is just getting up and running on the ground. In terms of kind of volunteering in a changing world, I guess since the last Time Well Spent survey, as we know and have heard, there have been considerable changes to how we live our lives. And this has, I guess, inevitably impacted on how we volunteer. And I was really interested to see that online volunteering has become more prominent, and that people who volunteer in that way report equal satisfaction to those who do so in other ways. But I think it is important to acknowledge some of the pros and cons of this shift towards online volunteering. So on the pro side, obviously helps people connect anywhere, anytime, can serve as a tool for breaking down social and geographical barriers to volunteering. And it is obviously an important part of fostering communities in their widest sense, such as communities of interest, rather than those just based in a single place. But on the downside, we do need to think carefully. Digital access and digital skills are not ubiquitous, and that online interface does remove some of the personal touches of volunteering. So we as government are designing our programmes, but also volunteers more broadly would be in a good place to think about how and when is best to use online volunteering. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And it's really heartening to see that why people get involved has been consistent, even if their current volunteering reality is different. And we've seen through a number of national crises and celebrations that volunteers consistently step up when needed. And it's something we're looking at in terms of a legacy of big event volunteering. So things like the Big Help Out and the Commonwealth Games, and enabling people to continue volunteering and tapping into their motivations to do so is such an important part of creating successful volunteering legacies. And the way in which Time Well Spent gets to the heart of why people want to volunteer can help us design these pathways in a more continual cycling of volunteering. And it's something we're keen to look at more closely. And then just finally, in terms of opportunities for future development and joint working and collaboration, we do need to acknowledge that there are challenges that have come out of this data. Participation, satisfaction and likelihood to continue volunteering, as we heard, have all decreased, albeit some marginally. And we in government are working through what we can do to help in that space. And we've mentioned the Know Your Neighbourhood Fund, and that's, you know, working with museums to libraries, social enterprises to community centres to help build relationships and make people feel more connected in their communities. And then just to end on kind of our minister, I think Alex mentioned earlier that, you know, Minister Andrew is very, very committed to volunteering and tackling loneliness. He really is. He's genuinely passionate and personally very keen to do more and better in this space. And the department as a whole obviously is particularly interested in the equity, diversity and inclusion dimension to volunteering. Minister Andrew is also the Minister for Equalities as well as the Minister for Civil Society. And DCMS are funding NCVO to carry out further research into the volunteer experience of those from ethnically diverse backgrounds, which was mentioned again in Amy's presentation. And we're hoping to have something to share on that in the autumn of this year. Time Well Spent found that volunteers are less likely to report diverse peer groups, and we've still got a way to go, I think, before we can think of volunteering as truly diverse, equitable, inclusive throughout England. But I think by working with and through individuals, groups and organisations like Vision for Volunteering, we're aiming to take a much more collaborative approach to work towards that goal. I think I've possibly gone over 5 minutes, for which apologies, but hopefully some of that is of interest. I look forward to the Q&A, and I think I'm now handing back to Alex. Thank you, Alex.
You are. Thank you so much, Alison. And really great to hear, particularly about the kind of wider work, obviously, that DCMS supports in volunteering, but also how that connects to other priorities like loneliness as well. So thank you. Just before I hand over to our next speaker, just to say that we are in the Q&A still accepting questions, but we are kind of trying to answer as many of these questions as we go. So you'll probably see me, Amy and Ray furiously typing away to try and answer as many of these questions. We will not be able to answer all of these questions, the 30 that are kind of open questions in this session, but we will try our best to get as many answered as we can. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Susie Holland, who's Deputy Chief Exec at Eczema Outreach Support, a national charity based in Scotland, for Susie's perspective. Susie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today. As Alex said, I'm from Eczema Outreach Support, and it'll be interesting to know if many of you have heard of us before, but a bit of background, we are based in West Lothian, just outside Edinburgh, and we provide practical and emotional support to children and young people with eczema and their families all across the UK, We're a really small team up here in Scotland, and the time well spent research has come at a fantastic time for us, because we are now looking at how do we deliver peer support, so volunteer-led peer support across the UK. And there's lots of nuggets from today that will be good to talk to you all about. So again, a bit of background: volunteers have been a really big part of our history at EOS. I'll call us EOS, Eczema Outreach Support. We were started in the back bedroom of a mum who was the mum of a young girl with very severe eczema in West Lothian. They had nobody to turn to. They felt incredibly isolated and alone. So she got a team of volunteers together. They got into that spare bedroom in their house, and Eczema Outreach Support was born. So volunteers, as I say, are a massive part of our history. They're a big part of our present, but they're actually going to be an even bigger part of our future. So on my slide, you can see there's 3 points that I really want to talk about today and what they mean for us at EOS. The first one is volunteer remotely. The second one is looking at the importance of flexibility. And the third one is touching on a few points around volunteering and 18 to 24-year-olds. So if we start with volunteering remotely, this is enormously significant for us. The fact that volunteer remotely is now commonplace, as Amy has shared, but also that satisfaction rates are pretty equal between those volunteering remotely and those that don't, is really encouraging for us. As I said, we're based up in Scotland, but we're operating across the UK. And if we're ever to realise our ambitions of supporting every family that has eczema that needs us across the UK, then volunteers are so essential, and remote volunteering is a really important part of how we can achieve that. But also significant for us is that a lot of our past volunteers, our current volunteers, and again, I think our future volunteers are affected by eczema. And as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, eczema is a really chronic, really tricky condition to manage, and it is completely unpredictable. One day you might have a huge flare and you don't feel you can leave the house. Another day, everything might be okay. But remote volunteering gives that opportunity for volunteers managing eczema to get involved in ways that they might not have done before, and for us to give them opportunities that they might not have had before. And I guess thinking about it, it also applies to all kinds of long-term conditions as well, and disabilities. And I just feel like this is really positive and encouraging, and opening the doors of new experiences for volunteers, but also new experiences for us as organisations as we bring in a more diverse group of volunteers. So again, with this, and I'm kind of thinking about what Alison was just saying before about online volunteerings, I think something for us as organisations to really consider is how do we make sure that we're creating that sense of volunteer community. If we've got volunteers volunteer remotely across the UK, doing it from home, we really need to think about how we're making them feel part of the team. Something we've tried with some of our volunteers, excuse me, is a closed Facebook group, and trying to use digital tools to do that. As you can imagine, it was great for some volunteers, our younger volunteers not so much. So it's about thinking about different ways that we can make sure people feel part of the team, but also fundamentally making sure there's really good induction, really good training in place, and also a clear support network so that volunteers who are remote, who are not seeing us every day, know where they can get support when they need it. Moving on to flexibility, and it all kind of ties in nicely to remote volunteering for us, is again seeing that flexibility is valued very highly. We saw that when Ray spoke about it in the research there. And it gives us a lot of food for thought at EOS when we're thinking about developing this peer support model, where there are potential for a lot of diverse and a lot of meaty volunteer roles. But actually what it says to me is that we need to be co-designing these roles with volunteers, with potential volunteers, to really understand how we can get that flexibility within those roles, but also to communicate that flexibility that will be within those roles. Because the research to me is saying, if we want to offer that quality volunteer experience, we need to be thinking about flexibility, making sure it's built in, but also making sure that we're telling people about it as well. And finally, looking at volunteering in 18 to 24-year-olds, which is really close to my heart, because at EOS, we have a lot of volunteers that are of that younger age group, particularly with our youth panel, who are advocates for young people with eczema. To see that satisfaction rates were lower in this age group is a real alarm bell for me. To also see that one of the barriers is around that worry about out-of-pocket expenses. And it's for me about thinking we need to be talking more to this age group. We need to delve a bit deeper into this research. And I'd love to kind of know a bit more about all of your experiences of working with younger volunteers. But is it that we need to ask more questions? Do we need to understand more about people's motivations in this age group? Are we able to meet those motivations? Is there flexibility to change roles to give more experiences to meet their goals and meet their motivations? And if we're not able to do that, about being honest about it, but also just that communication again, talk about, you know, how we can cover those out-of-pocket expenses, talk about the support that they might receive, and just really understand from that age group what they want to get out of it and how we can help them do that. I guess for me, younger people are the future of our charities. They're our future volunteers, they're our future donors, they're our future CEOs. So we want to make sure we're not losing them before they even start their journey with us. I'm going to leave it there. I could talk about this for hours, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A. But just a kind of closing point, a feel for us at Exmouth Outreach Support. There's a few small changes that we can make using this research to make a better and more quality experience for our volunteers. But fundamentally, I think for us, we just need to do more listening and asking more questions. And I think we can offer a lot of quality experiences for volunteers for many years to come. Thank you. I'll hand back to Alex.
Susie, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that, and particularly the spotlight that you brought there on kind of young people and kind of youth volunteering. Lots of comments in the chat, particularly about some of the kind of big programs that used to exist to kind of foster volunteering amongst kind of young people, and some of those kind of no longer here as services, as projects and opportunities. How we encourage and foster that spirit of voluntary action, I think, is something we're going to have to give lots of thought and attention to, not just from this findings, but from some of the other kind of big reports that have come out recently as well. Finally, I'm going to hand over to Stephanie Thompson from Community Impact Bucks. Loads of questions actually and comments about the role of local infrastructure and how kind of volunteering is often local, and the support that infrastructure organisations give to charities, but also to informal groups to make that happen. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all this morning. As mentioned, we are a local infrastructure organisation in Buckinghamshire, just outside London. And I'm also the lead for the Buckinghamshire Volunteer Matching Service, or as here at Community Impact Bucks, or as I refer to it from now as the VMS. It's a brokerage service across Buckinghamshire that helps place organisations looking for volunteers with people who want to help out. So I'll touch on 3 points shown on this slide that we are seeing at local level. Firstly, flexibility as a top motivator. Secondly, engagement, communication and listening. And third, raising awareness and challenging misconceptions about volunteering. So first, touching on flexibility, which we know is highly valued and which Susie and Ray have just touched upon as well. Whilst we know local organisations offer a lot of role flexibility, interestingly, local feedback has actually been that some organisations were still unwilling to be a bit flexible around weekly commitments, making it harder to volunteer. From the survey among non-volunteers, the top ways they could be encouraged to start volunteering related to flexibility. However, we've heard locally from volunteers that even a small degree of flexibility would help make volunteering more accessible for those juggling commitments, such as the school run. So for instance, shifts being moved and scheduled from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. rather than 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. We've seen other examples of how timings of roles impact recruitment. So one local highly active volunteer told us they felt that it was hard to find roles in the evening and at weekends that weren't focused on youth work, which not everybody wants to do. We know that organisations are offering a wide range of flexible options, but I think there's an opportunity here for us to take it further. We could take a step back from our current volunteer roles and see which tasks could be delivered by one-off volunteers or remotely through short-term commitments, or at different times of the day and week. You know, can the usual way that we do things be flexed to individual needs? We do want to hold on to our volunteers, but of course there are some volunteers who want to move around different roles. How can we make that easier so that hopefully volunteers will want to return to our organisations in the future? These are just some ideas to think about and consider. On to the next point of communication. We see locally the importance of engaging, understanding and listening to volunteers throughout their entire volunteer experience. Given that the survey shows that a top reason for people continuing to volunteer is the group, club or organisation they help, it's vital that volunteers have the opportunity to get to know that organisation. Volunteers in Bucks and potential volunteers have expressed a clear preference, over 60% for both groups in our local research, for accessing volunteering through visiting organisations first, such as open days and taster sessions. Oh, I'll just stop my camera there. We found through the VMS that getting to really hear and understand volunteers' needs, interests and motivations, and having opportunities for them to get to know the organisation and what's involved initially and on an ongoing basis is so important in helping to develop a two-way understanding, and for volunteers to feel valued and motivated to join and stay with the organisation. So, for example, some volunteers register with the VMS saying that they want to help, but don't quite know how or what that looks like. And here, our VMS team, who are themselves volunteers, talk this through with registered volunteers, continue to stay in touch, and provide regular updates through fortnightly newsletters. And finally, I just want to touch on raising awareness and challenging misconceptions about volunteering. The survey has highlighted something we've seen locally, whereby some volunteers feel like their volunteering is too much like paid work and that they have unreasonable expectations placed on them. For instance, expectations to provide a significant number of hours and days per week over several years, which initially can be incredibly off-putting. Again, I suggest this is an opportunity for us all to think about how the role could come across. Here in Buckinghamshire, there's an opportunity to raise awareness of local roles. It's another reason why we are moving the VMS onto one central online platform with additional support on hand where it's needed, as a way of making volunteering more visible and accessible. Many volunteers find the VMS through search engines and Google, and we have seen how search engine optimization, or SEO, and Google Ads can help with role visibility. So just to conclude, and to echo Ray's points earlier, I think there's a real opportunity here to promote locally what volunteering can look like. For instance, nearly half of non-volunteers involved in our local research into volunteering said that they didn't have enough spare time, but many also said they could give 5 hours a month, which is enough for many roles. So there's an opportunity to bust myths around volunteering, that it can be flexible and doesn't need to require a large or regular time commitment, so that this precious time can be spent as well as possible. Thank you so much. I'll hand back to Alex, and thank you for bearing with me with my camera. It's having a moment today.
Absolutely not, Stephanie. Thank you so much. We heard everything very clearly. So thank you so much for your contributions there. And again, lots of claps and things coming back, and appreciation for your particular contribution there as well. So thank you. That wraps up the kind of panelist and almost the kind of sections, I suppose, from us in terms of presenting today's research and then sharing some thoughts on policy and practice. It's fantastic. We've had so many questions in the Q&A. We've answered about half of them so far, and we've got a couple of kind of key topics that I'm going to pick up in the next 10 minutes. Rather than kind of go through a particular question by question, there were some clear kind of groupings and themes that have emerged that I think I'm going to put to the panelists instead. It's also fantastic to see kind of a lot of self-organizing happening in the chat box, people answering their own questions, forming new groups, sharing kind of lots of thoughts and insight too. So thank you so much for that as well. That's almost as kind of as vital and a kind of useful thing of us bringing people together for these kind of events is all the stuff happening in the chat box, alongside obviously all the contributions here as well. So just to also just give my kind of panelists and kind of colleagues a heads up, I'm going to kind of first of all come to Amy first to ask there are lots of questions in the chat about the finding that we had here about volunteer opportunities feeling more like paid work. and impact there on kind of satisfaction. If any of the other panelists have anything that they would like to kind of contribute as part of that, please do raise your hand and I'll come to you. I then also, there's lots of questions in the chat about the role of local infrastructure. And so I really appreciate, Stephanie, if you have anything more to add on that, but also a number of questions, particularly thinking about the role of DCMS in supporting local infrastructure. Alison, something you also kind of hinted at in your comments as well. So would love to bring you in there as well. And then kind of probably trying to finish off with a little bit of overall, kind of there's a narrative sometimes that volunteering is in crisis. Is this kind of over-egged is one of the questions. And if it is, what do we need to be doing to tackle that? Or actually, is there something slightly different going on in different parts of the country that isn't quite reflected in national surveys like this? But first of all, I'm going to go to Amy to pick up on some of the questions around the kind of the paid work, the feeling like paid work aspect.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting area to look at. It's hard with the survey to really kind of unpick exactly what's contributing to that. But I think when we look at kind of different aspects of the survey responses, it might give us a little bit of insight. I think one of the findings that Ray kind of touched upon around that increase in people saying that there's too much stress that was causing them to stop volunteering is notable. It wasn't one of the key reasons, but I think that kind of well-being aspect is really key for that kind of feeling too much like paid work. There may also be kind of other aspects that are coming up around, we know that more people are kind of, perhaps at laptops. We saw the increase in remote volunteering. That could be contributing to a kind of work-like aspect of volunteering. Again, we can only kind of, we don't have the kind of confirmation that that is the cause, but I think there are a few things. And we know that kind of volunteer well-being was an aspect that was kind of focused on a lot during the pandemic. But I think what our findings highlight is the need to kind of continue thinking about that kind of aspect of volunteering. And I think that, since volunteer managers have started to kind of, play that role, which maybe before the pandemic they might not have done, that it really kind of highlights the, perhaps the role that volunteer managers have in kind of supporting them in that space. And I think that kind of, we coupled the findings when we talked about kind of too much like paid work as unreasonable expectations. And I think it's, again, thinking about, what roles we're giving to volunteers, and whether that, how the kind of boundaries between what that looks like in terms of, being paid work or not. But we know it's not a kind of easy picture, because we know that obviously a lot of volunteering is kind of volunteer led. So yeah, it's not an easy one there. I don't know if I've actually answered questions there, Alex, but just kind of talking about it as a whole, I don't know if that's helpful.
Absolutely, it is helpful. Thank you very much, Amy. I'm going to come next to pick up around kind of from Alison and Stephanie around kind of the role of local infrastructure, but broader, the kind of local infrastructure that might be CVS's, but that could also be volunteer centres and their role locally in, I suppose, responding to some of these findings, but also the kind of the great work that kind of local infrastructure, volunteer managers do at kind of local level. Particularly then also, Alison, if you have something from DCMS's perspective. And just a heads up to Ray, kind of other lead researcher on time well spent. Ray, I'd love to come to you after this question about the well-being of volunteers. Mirabai asked a great question about, did we talk about the well-being of volunteers in the survey? But also you led some of our kind of fantastic research last year that looked particularly at the impact of COVID and the pandemic on volunteering, and particularly we focused a lot of the findings there around well-being. So wanted Ray to pick up on some of those previous findings as well. First of all, Stephanie, can I come to you to talk a little bit about the kind of some of the questions here about what support does like local and volunteer infrastructure need, whether that's from national government or other sources as well.
Hi there, Alex. Yeah. I think certainly that sort of government support is incredibly important for infrastructure, and we know that actually the local sector and organisations that we work with really get a lot from the peer support that we offer as an infrastructure organisation, and that networking and that advice and that intelligence sharing, and having that sort of central local place to come together, I think is very important. And I would say that as coming from an infrastructure organisation, but we do hear the benefits and the impact of having that opportunity. So I do worry if that is if that support for infrastructure is diminished or is kind of less available, what that impact could therefore be on local organisations and where they would turn to at a local level for that help and support that they need. And as we know, it's just, so much of the fabric of our society is through the VCSE sector. So without that infrastructure support at a kind of governance level, at a sort of support level, advice, volunteering, all of the things that infrastructure advise and support with, as well as also that national networking and connections like we're having today, and being able to all connect together. I think taking that away or kind of reducing that support could be very worrying for the sector.
Thanks, Stephanie. Alison, can I come to you? You hinted around kind of support from DCMS around kind of infrastructure. Tell us more about what can the government do, or what are the government thinking in terms of supporting kind of local infrastructure or volunteer infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So I guess two things just to say by way of kind of headline, I guess. The first one is that, obviously we are hearing the messaging that infrastructure organisations and obviously Time Well Spent obviously reinforce the vital role that they play. And, others have said that, during the pandemic, they were absolutely critical to the response at the local level. So we do definitely recognises kind of the role that they play. I think we want to keep the conversation going with the sector around the role of infrastructure, and we've talked a lot already to NAVCA and to NCVO, both through the Vision for Volunteering and separately, about kind of what the future might be and what role government could potentially play in supporting that. I think there is always a question when government is developing policies, funds, etc. Are we best placed to do it? Are we the only person that could do it? What is our value add? And obviously, particularly in a tight resourcing situation as we are at the moment, those questions are really critical to informing what role government might be able to play. But I think we need to step back a bit and make sure that we understand kind of what the need is and what the evidence is telling us. So, as I say, we're talking to NCVO and NAVCA, and we'll be looking at this more over the coming year. So it would be good if people kind of on this webinar could feed their thinking through NAVCA and NCVO if they're members, or more directly through to us. We'd be really interested in having a think about that. We know there's less funding available in all of this, but we are looking at some research projects to inform future policy development. I think that's probably all I can say for now, because it's a bit of a work in progress, but just to acknowledge that it's not something we're not interested in and we are not thinking about, and we recognise that there's a conversation needed. So I hope that gives some comfort, but it won't be tomorrow. It's going to be kind of a slightly longer term thing.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to come to Stephanie, who has a hand up, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to kind of move into the final kind of wrap up and conclusions. Stephanie.
Just to follow on quickly, just to add that I think what's really also important about the local infrastructure is the local knowledge that we have, and those connections into communities and those relationships, which I can appreciate at national level or at a high level it's difficult to have. It's almost impossible to have those very sort of more nuanced and sort of subtle connections with local communities. And I think And as you were saying, Alison, that really was shown through the COVID crisis, where local communities came together. And I think so those connections and that support and that intelligence and that knowledge is something that is incredibly valuable, incredibly powerful. And yeah, I think it's wonderful to hear that there's going to be sort of further, review of how that could be supported going forward, because we know it's just essential, absolutely essential to the fabric of our society, and resilience as well. So yeah, just wanted to kind of wave that flag a little bit. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And I'm afraid at this point we are going to have to kind of begin wrapping things up. But we've answered about 2/3 at least of the questions in the Q&A button format there. So please do look at some of the answers provided by me and the rest of the team. And apologies that we haven't managed to get through the kind of 60 odd questions that you've all asked, but hopefully we have provided some insights and further insight into the report. Lots of the questions that are still there, some of them are covered in the report, and we have both the kind of full report available today, but also the executive summary for those who might be short on time. We also talk extensively about the methodology behind this year's research, as well as how that is comparable to kind of 2019. And so please do take a look at that, and please always do get in touch if you have any particular kind of questions. Of course, I would say this, but these findings for me from Time Well Spent are kind of essential reading for those of us kind of in national infrastructure, local infrastructure, for volunteer managers, for policymakers, for funders. They give insight into kind of what the situation is like at the moment, but also it kind of validates many of the trends that we saw from 2019 and kind of in through previous research as well. It is a difficult picture in some ways. Overall, the numbers of people volunteering monthly and kind of regularly, yearly, are down. And though it's great to see in our research that overall, when people volunteer, they do have a really good experience, people are slightly less satisfied when we did this survey than in 2019. And they're also slightly less likely to be volunteering in a year's time. Now, for some, that might be a validation of the experience they're having. It might be good that people move on from volunteering opportunities, but for many, it will feel like a spirit of voluntary action might be diminishing. When volunteers are volunteering, they see the difference they make, and they feel positive towards the organisations they volunteer for. So when it comes to formal volunteering, this is a credit to the organisations and the volunteer managers who help make volunteering a worthwhile thing for people to do, but also that they're maximising the experience, they're getting the most out of volunteering for them as individuals, and they're seeing the impact that has on the organisation, on the communities that they're working for and with. And of course, I'd be remiss of me not to mention the Association of Volunteer Managers, who do obviously fantastic support work to support those who are supporting and managing volunteers through organisations particularly. Today's findings do give us some really practical things to think about. So when it comes to things like expenses, people don't know they can claim their expenses, and it puts them off. People are worried about the amount of time that they're being expected, particularly older volunteers, which is a bit of a shift. Often, sometimes there are too many similarities to paid work. That might be because many of us have shifted to working all day on our laptops from home, and maybe volunteer experiences are a bit similar to that. So it might be that we're needing to think more about those kind of opportunities, not just being online, but also thinking about what do people really want from that experience. And also just simply asking people to get involved. A fifth of those who don't volunteer say they just haven't been asked. And whilst that can be difficult, people don't always tell us the truth in surveys. It might be that actually that's a really good place to start, is by asking people to lend a hand and get involved, and to find out whether that does make a difference. Alongside this research, there is a kind of enormous amount of activity in the volunteering space. In this year alone, we've seen the big help out in May. We've seen the kind of second phase of the Vision for Volunteering launch, with our paid members of staff leading that effort and that aspirational vision by 2032 for volunteering to be brilliant for everyone, everywhere. We've just finished Volunteers Week, the 39th Volunteers Week, 40th anniversary next year, celebrating, recognising the enormous efforts of volunteers. And we know that big organisations are coming together to think about what can they just be getting on with when it comes to changing and improving the experience of volunteers in their organisations. Now, we know, and we think at NCVO, there is great opportunity for more of that to be coordinated, so that actually if we've got that vision for volunteering that sets out very clearly what we think it should look and feel like by 2032, how do all of these efforts that are happening kind of support one another, complement each other, so that we're all pushing towards the same end result. Certainly not trying to compete, as I don't think we are, but making sure that our strategies align and that we're kind of complementary there. We're now going to, just before I finish, finally, just to say an enormous thanks. So many people make this research happen, but this would not happen without Ray and Amy from the NCVO research team, as well as our other colleagues Nyara and Brad, who did enormous amounts of work at the data analysis stage, and Oliver, who was previously in our team too. Alongside all of our colleagues at NCVO, whether it's our comms team pushing out on socials, whether it's our marketing team, our digital teams, who are making it all look brilliant online. Thank you so much to them. Our three panelists today, Susie, Stephanie and Alison, thank you for your time and your contributions. Particularly to DCMS again for funding and supporting this research, and of course our partners at YouGov who do this work, who ask the questions and who get out there to ask what's going on. Before we finish, two more things. First of all, your feedback. So something is going to pop up on your screen now. There's a feedback poll for you to just tell us how you thought the event was today. We do tens and tens of events. Thousands of people participate in NCVO events, partnered obviously often with others across the sector. We take this feedback exceptionally seriously. It improves all the time how we do things for these events. And so please do let us know, not just on the very satisfied criteria, but also if you have other things you think we should be considering, please do let us know. While that magic kind of continues to happen, let me tell you a little bit about what's coming next. So today we've launched the full report. Please check it out online. Please continue the discussion using Time Well Spent 2023 on Twitter. For those of you who have attended this live, you'll have got the slides for this session now in the chat box earlier. A number of times Nick has posted the slides. And on the next slide, Ray, you'll be able to see lots of the resources that we have available to support you, both pieces of research like Time Well Spent, also our extensive range of guidance, online support that is kind of free practical support there, as well as the things that we do for training as well. Do check out the Vision for Volunteering, our kind of big partnership with a number of other organisations, many of whom are on today's call as well, to find out more about how you can get involved in the vision. We've got events coming up around the country and online in June and July, as well as many later in the year as well. It only leaves me to say an enormous thank you again, and we will be launching our next Time Well Spent report in October, November time, which will be particularly looking at the experience of ethnic and minoritized groups and their particular experience of volunteering as well. So thank you so much for this, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you once again, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.